think it's one of the mysteries of the operatic repertoire, why this opera in particular doesn't have more currency. It's an opera on a story everyone knows, King Arthur, Lancelot, Guinevere. So you have every reference point from Camelot to Monty Python, and every child sort of knows the outlines of the story. And it has something that's very popular these days. It has a little bit of magic and a little whiff of paganism, a kind of world that we've become more familiar with the success of the films of The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. So kind of there's a druidic past which makes its way into a story which is part Roman and part Christian. It's about this mythical person, King Arthur. He has this round table of knights which has brought presumably peace and justice and equanimity and good rule, as in a great Greek tragedy, as in Oedipus. The objective is not only the individual and the characters of the play itself, but the well-being of the community, of the politics, if you will, and the well-being of a whole society. And King Arthur represents this ideal of the well-governed state. And he is the selfless ruler, the ideal political leader. The myth of the story, of course, is that all this gets undone by how difficult it is to live by one's ideals, especially when one confronts not only the sort of classic duality of the way we think of ourselves. We have a soul and we have a body. And in many theological constructs, the soul has a kind of immortality and purity to it, and the body has a kind of corruption and temptation with it. And in this case, that's the nature of the story, that Lancelot is a great guy, and he's Arthur's right-hand man, but he has this overwhelming sexual attraction and romantic attraction to Arthur's wife, Guinevere. Guinevere, on the other hand, admires Arthur too, but, you know, she's a married woman, and one doesn't have to be reminded of the 7-Year Itch movie by Billy Wilder with Marilyn Monroe, that marriage, as many viewers of this preview to the opera will recognize, is an institution that fails a high percentage of its time, and because it's so difficult. So it's even more difficult if you're married to this larger-than-life heroic figure, King Arthur. So in her loneliness as a queen, which is very common in monarchies, she and Lancelot create this relationship, and therefore you have the classic triangle. And so there's a dynamic between Arthur and Lancelot, and a dynamic between Guinevere and Arthur, and Guinevere and Lancelot, and Arthur and Guinevere. It is a story which Chausson has written. He wrote his own libretto, and there are many versions of this King Arthur story, and he took one which looks most like Tristan. So it's an opera that's very indebted to the Wagner of Tristan, and a little bit to Parsifal, but not really to the late Wagner, because the ideology and the musical vocabulary isn't quite aligned at all. So the story and the opera are organized, again, in a 3-act version of the story, which has a high point in the end of the 2nd act. In Tristan, it's the confrontation between Mark and Tristan, the friends, because Tristan is first and foremost the loyal servant of King Mark. And it's only with, you know, magic potions that he gets himself involved with Isolde. In this story, it's a much more interesting story, because actually Lancelot falls in love with Guinevere, and Guinevere with Lancelot voluntarily. They are modern people. They're not mythic characters. We sit through Tristan, great as the music is. There's something always slightly discomforting about the idea that these people actually are in this rapturous love as a result of drugs, not of their free will. In this case, Chausson has written the two main characters in the love affair, which is Lancelot and Guinevere, he's written them as modern people. Everybody in the audience will understand the swing in moods, the shift from passion to argument, to disappointment, to reproach. I mean, it could be an argument that takes place in a kitchen or a living room or in your car or in a shopping mall. In other words, it is, I don't want to denigrate at all these characters, but what Chausson's done brilliantly is bring the story into the modern age. That is to say, the central love conflict, which leads to the death of Guinevere and the death of Lancelot, is portrayed very humanly and very recognizably. He decided to take this story and imitate Wagner in a good way. We often talk about composers and say, well, you know, he's not original. Well, this is some bizarre requirement which became wildly popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. If you viewed music as an art form where there are shared standards of beauty, it's not Bach's originality or Mozart's originality, or Beethoven's originality, but what they do with the tradition they inherit. Chausson's doing the same thing. He's taking a Wagnerian tradition and doing something with it, doing something new with it, because this opera is written in 1895, which is 30 years, more than 30 years after Tristan. So Tristan is a great influence, and he even quotes it, but it's his starting point for his own self-expression, which is the mark of a great composer. Whom are you going to build on? So he built on the best and on the transformation of the operatic experience that Wagner created in the mid-19th century. So if you look this opera up, you'll hear a lot of criticism. Even Debussy was very critical of it, that it was too Wagnerian. I don't think that's right. I think it was Wagnerian inspired, but went in a new direction. The opera also makes it very easy to follow, because there are themes which you follow through the opera that are associated with people and events. It isn't quite the Wagnerian leitmotif system, but it's very clear that music is used to tell the story, and you'll recognize it as you go through the opera. The other thing that is terrific is that the music is ravishingly beautiful and beautifully orchestrated, and it just flows by. The singers we have are fantastic. I mean, we have all really young singers, and the leads are uniformly terrific. And we have a wonderful director, and she has done a wonderful job with this, melding both the modern and the traditional. And it's a fantastic opera. It should be in the repertory. Why it isn't in the repertory is probably easily explained. You know, things are not always rational. They're a function of happenstance. So Chausson was killed in a freak bicycling accident. After he completed the opera, but he never heard the opera. The opera was actually premiered a decade after his death. Not in Paris, but in Brussels. And by that time, Debussy had emerged as a kind of a figure of the future, if you will, of the fashion of the direction of music. And Chausson seemed a little bit more something of the past, and it's very hard to promote a new work by a dead composer. And so he had the misfortune of having his masterpiece lie unperformed at the time of his death. The opera has had not a great history. And then for some reason, because it has many love duets, somebody got the idea that this opera is static. In other words, it's I don't know where people get that idea. Somehow people pack, every C to hear Parsifal, which is as static as it gets. And Tristan is long as well. It's not filled by constant, quick-moving action. So why this opera somehow got this label. But opera companies, opera directors, opera conductors are notoriously conservative. And they mistake the audience, in my opinion, and they don't trust the audience. We do. We've had great success over years of doing operas that aren't spoken for, and we'll continue to do it because we actually trust the audience. We think the audience will respond and is hungry for something new, the same way they want to see the newest movie or the newest Amazon or Netflix episode, the newest podcast. They are attuned to not repeating themselves. I like to say, when I make a comparison, that people don't go to the movies every year to see Casablanca 4 times. They don't. It may be, for someone, the greatest movie ever made, but no, seeing it every once in a while is plenty. And we need to do the same in opera. We need new opera, which is happening more than it did in the past, and we need to look at the riches in the repertory. And I think one of the reasons this opera hasn't succeeded is because no one's really given it a try, and because it got tarred somehow with this notion that it's not original or not action-packed. The most famous opera of the period later is Debussy's Pelléas, which is hardly action-packed either, but it has the reputation of being musically very original and gorgeous. This is completely gorgeous. It's fantastic music, and it is simply put beautiful. We thought, the Fisher Center and Summerscape thought that if we're going to come back with the performing arts after the pandemic, what should we come back with? Should we just go back to what we've been doing all along? Are people going to rush out of their homes, away from their isolation, back into the social experience of being in a public space, sharing with strangers and friends and families the theatrical experience? Are they going to do that just seeing a Tosca again, or seeing a Walküre again, or a magic flute, or Aida, the chestnuts of the repertory? I think not. That's great. But we need to take stock of what we've missed. We need to take stock of the fact that this isolation was pernicious to our politics, to our view of what being alive is about. It made us much more vulnerable to manipulation, to paranoia, to believing in conspiracy theories, for mistrusting our neighbor. Isolation is the most important tool of dictators, of tyrants, and of mass movements which traffic in fear and distrust, particularly people whom one thinks aren't like oneself. The obligation of a performing arts institution is to come back into the public sphere, into the public space, and do so in a way which promotes freedom, democracy, the rights of the individual, the independence of thought, the sense of collective destiny, the sense of common purpose. And so what kind of art, what kind of theater makes it happen? Particularly in opera. Opera is the most human of art forms, in the sense that it has no analog in real life. We can't all talk simultaneously and be understood by anybody. It's only by the mixture of words and music and action that you can invent this magical world. It's the only art form that probably is completely resistant to reproduction. Yeah, you can listen to a recording of an opera. You can watch an HD, but that's not opera. It's either a recording, which is like a photograph. I can't say, I've seen the Grand Canyon. If I told you a picture, I know what the Grand Canyon looks like. I could even have studied it in great detail in a geology class. But I haven't been to the Grand Canyon until I find myself in the space of the Grand Canyon and its grandeur. Opera is the same way. You can watch an HD, But that's a film with music. It's not opera. Opera requires you to be there, to be in the moment with the three-dimensionality of all the elements, the scenic elements, the dramatic elements, the musical elements, and to make up the story myself, to make the experience by watching what I want to watch, not what the camera person wants, not what the director of the film wants, but what I want to see. So the heroine is singing over here, but I'm looking at some minor character, or some extras, or I'm not looking at all, I'm just listening to the music, and then my attention turns back, not to the main event, let's say she dies. I'm looking at the reaction of the people to her dying, which you make up the story when you're an actual participant as a listener and a viewer in the opera house. It's a wonderful art form, not only because it's so imaginative, has so many elements, but it is the art form that requires the listener, the viewer, to make the story. They're not simply completely wedded to the visual angle and the storytelling that we often are used to on the screen. So our summer extravaganza is always an opera. So we're going to come back to this community, and now with streaming to the world community, with an opera. We thought we should really double down on our mission, which is not to bring our version of something you already know, our Hamlet, our Macbeth. No, we need to bring to the public something that they haven't experienced, that reminds them of our past, our continuity between the past, is from our history that we don't know, and is lovable on first encounter. So, because we had a festival planned for French music in the 20th century, I made the decision that we should do this opera, which I had done in New York some 20 years ago in concert and recorded with the BBC in the interim, and which I've always believed in, and that would also deliver an important message. For those viewers who know something about this opera, will know that the end of the opera is Arthur moves on. It's ambiguous, but he moves on. He ascends like a Christ-like figure to a kind of ethereal presence. He departs this world. And Chausson had this transfiguration in mind and wrote the most beautiful and ravishing chorus finale, just voices, and orchestra chorus, but there are moments where just the voices sing, in this kind of quasi-religious music as Arthur sort of ascends and drifts off into the past. The music is terrific, and Chausson had this idea, which might have been a good one in his day, of having the chorus off stage, very distant, so you just hear it as if it's coming from the sky, angels. It's a great trick. However, the problem is it's very long for an ending, and for our purposes, it doesn't make the point which the opera wishes to make, which is that ultimately we are no longer, as human beings, dependent on heroes, on a round table of knights. If we want a well-ordered state, we want to live in harmony and prosperity in a just world, we can't depend on leaders who consider themselves different. We cannot rely on some aristocracy that we invent. We have to actually rely on ourselves. So Louisa and I have brought the chorus on stage. So the opera ends with the audience seeing the people inheriting the mantle of idealism from Arthur. Gone are the heroes and heroines. You know, we have a debate in this country about statues, taking down Confederate statues. I think, you know, it's long overdue. It's like changing the names of streets in Europe, you know, after the Second World War or after the fall of communism. We don't have a Stalin Square, we don't have a Stalingrad, you know, and they don't want a Leningrad anymore, so they've renamed their places. And we have the right to do that as well as we confront the darker moments of our history. This opera makes the point is forget heroes and heroines. It's a mistake to rely on leaders. We have to rely on our ability to govern, as Lincoln said, you know, by the people, for the people, and being of the people. So Chausson, who wrote this after the fall of the monarchy in 1870, in the midst of the French Republic, had a kind of tacit Republican message here, which is we have progressed beyond the age of King Arthur heroes, or the wish that our life would be made better if only some knight in shining armor literally arrived on a horse, right, with a bunch of other knights and would set everything straight. That is the path to tyranny and to autocracy, and that's not Chausson's message. So when we decide to come back from the isolation of the pandemic with a theatrical experience, what better experience than the most beautiful evocation of one of the most classic legends of nobility and idealism, in which the main characters all pass on into history and leave as their heirs the collective people on this earth.